Homeless veteran bullied by immigrants, Mel Gibson sees the scene and does the unthinkable. George Carter sat on the cold pavement, his back against the wall of an abandoned storefront in downtown Los Angeles. The city bustled around him. People passing by without a second glance, as if he were nothing more than another piece of the urban landscape. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around his shoulders, the chill of the evening creeping through his worn clothes. His hands, rough and scarred, trembled slightly as he cupped them for warmth. Once, those same hands had held a rifle, had saved lives, had fought for something greater than himself. Now, they were empty. George had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, witnessing horrors that still haunted his dreams. The memories never faded. Explosions in the night, the cries of wounded soldiers, the weight of fallen brothers. The war had ended for him years ago, but the battlefield never truly left his mind. PTSD clung to him like a shadow, whispering reminders of things he wished he could forget. He had tried to rebuild his life after returning home, but civilian. Life had been unkind. Jobs were scarce, relationships strained, and the weight of his trauma made even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. He had lost everything: his home, his dignity, and most days his will to keep going. Most people ignored him, but not everyone. A group of young men had taken a cruel interest in him. Diego, Ahmed, and Yuri, 3 teenagers who had come to the country seeking new opportunities, but who had found entertainment in tormenting those weaker than them. They spotted George often, lingering near the alleys or outside diners, where he quietly hoped for leftover scraps. At first, it had been taunts, muttered insults about how he smelled, how he looked. Then, they had started throwing things. Empty. Soda cans, bits of food, whatever they could find. George never fought back. He had fought enough in his life. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the boys approached again. George had managed to scavenge a few discarded blankets and a piece of cardboard to shield himself from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had just begun to settle in when Diego kicked over the pile of blankets, sending them tumbling into the street. "Come on, man, why you still here?" Diego sneered. "Go find a gutter or something." Ahmed laughed, grabbing George's tin cup and dumping its meager contents, a few coins, onto the sidewalk. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess you'll have to work for your money now." Yuri said nothing at first, but when he saw the others laughing, he joined in, shoving George's shoulder just hard enough to knock him sideways. The old veteran gritted his teeth, pressing his palms into the pavement to steady himself. His body ached, not just from the cold, but from years of hardship. "Please," George muttered, his voice hoarse. "Just let me be." Diego crouched in front of him, smirking. "Let you be? What, you think you deserve respect? You're nothing, man, just a waste of space." They weren't the first to say it. A part of George had begun to believe it himself. A sudden noise cut through the boys' laughter, the distinct sound of a car door slamming shut. Across the street, standing beside a sleek black SUV, was a man watching them. His face was partially hidden beneath a baseball cap, but there was no mistaking the sharp blue eyes, the rugged features that had once graced movie posters across the world. Mel Gibson. He didn't say anything at first, just observed the scene with an expression that was neither anger nor shock, just quiet disappointment. The boys hesitated, looking at one another. Even they weren't immune to recognizing a celebrity when they saw one. "Yo, is that—" Yuri started, but Diego elbowed him sharply. Mel crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps. The way he carried himself commanded attention, and for the first time that night, the boys looked uncertain. He stopped a few feet away from them, his gaze flickering to George, who still sat on the ground, his scattered belongings around him. "What are you doing?" Mel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Diego straightened up, forcing a smirk. "What's it to you?" Mel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down next to George, picking up the tin cup that had been tossed aside. He dropped a folded bill into it, one that was far too large to be mistaken for a simple act of charity. Then he looked up at the boys, his expression unreadable. "You think you're tough?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "You think it's funny to tear someone down?" Ahmed crossed his arms, trying to act unimpressed. "He's just a bum." Mel exhaled, shaking his head. "No, he's a soldier, a man who put his life on the line so that people like you could live here in peace." The words landed heavier than any punch. The boys exchanged glances, their earlier bravado wavering. George, still reeling from the whole scene, managed to croak out, "You don't have to do this." Mel looked at him, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, one survivor to another. "Yeah," Mel said softly, "I do." The streetlight flickered above them as silence stretched between the group. The boys, once so eager to torment, now shifted awkwardly. They hadn't expected this. They had come to mock a man they thought was beneath them, and instead they found themselves being judged by someone they respected. Diego cleared his throat, as if trying to find a way to save face. "We were just messing around," he muttered, but the confidence was gone from his voice. Mel stood up, looking at each of them in turn. "Go home," he said simply. "Think about what you've done." The boys hesitated, but the weight of the moment pressed down on them. One by one they turned and walked away, the laughter gone. George sat in stunned silence. He had expected another night of misery, another fight he had no strength left to win. Instead, a stranger, someone he had only seen on screens, had stepped in, not just to defend him but to acknowledge him. Mel offered a hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you something warm to eat." For the first time in years, George felt something he had long forgotten: hope. Mel Gibson stood motionless for a moment, his eyes locked onto the three boys who had been tormenting the homeless man. He had seen plenty of cruelty in the world, but there was something particularly unsettling about watching young men, full of life and opportunity, mock someone who had already lost everything. He took a slow breath, then pushed the car door shut behind him and walked toward them. The boys noticed him immediately. Diego, the self-appointed leader of the group, was the first to recognize him. His eyes widened, and he nudged Ahmed hard in the ribs. "Dude," he whispered, "that's Mel Gibson." Ahmed and Yuri turned, suddenly attentive. Seeing a celebrity up close, especially one as famous as Mel, was a shock. For a brief moment their attention shifted entirely from George, as if the veteran had ceased to exist. They expected Mel to say something, maybe tell them off like some concerned bystander who wanted to sound righteous, maybe even agree with them, laugh at the pathetic sight of the man curled up on the pavement. Mel's expression, however, was unreadable. His piercing blue eyes moved from one boy to the next before finally settling on George, who hadn't even looked up yet. "Leave him alone," Mel said, his voice firm but controlled. Diego blinked, then let out a short laugh. "What?" he scoffed. "Come on, man, we're just messing around." Mel didn't react. He simply stood there, unwavering. The streetlight cast a long shadow behind him, making him seem even more imposing. "He's just a bum," Diego continued, a little less confidently this time. "We're not hurting him. He's used to it." Still, Mel didn't take the bait. His gaze remained steady, his voice calm but carrying a weight that none of them could ignore. "You have no idea what true strength is," he said. The words hung in the air. Ahmed shuffled awkwardly. Yuri, who had been the quietest of the three, now looked down at his feet, avoiding Mel's stare. Diego, unwilling to back down so easily, folded his arms. "Strength?" he repeated. "What, you mean this guy? He can't even take care of himself." Mel exhaled slowly, then crouched beside George, who still hadn't spoken. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. George flinched at first, unaccustomed to human kindness, but something in Mel's presence made him relax just slightly. "This man," Mel said, still speaking to the boys, "has seen more, lived more, and survived more than you can even begin to understand." He helped George sit up, his movements careful, as if recognizing the weight this moment carried. "You think he's weak? You think he's nothing? He fought for this country. He put his life on the line so that people like you could live freely." Diego shifted, suddenly unsure of himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but found nothing to say. George finally lifted his head, his tired eyes meeting Mel's. He still wasn't sure why this was happening, why someone like him, forgotten, discarded, was suddenly being defended by a man the whole world knew. He had spent years feeling invisible, but now, in this moment, someone saw him. Mel reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Without hesitation, he took out a crisp $100 bill and tucked it into George's coat pocket. "Let's get you something warm," he said quietly. George's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, to say he didn't need charity, but his body betrayed him. He was starving, and then the unthinkable happened. Mel stood, took a step back, and with complete sincerity asked, "Do you trust me?" George frowned, unsure of what he meant. Mel gestured toward his car. "Come with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Diego's jaw nearly dropped. "Wait, what?" he blurted out. "You're going to let him in your car?" Mel didn't answer him. His focus was entirely on George. George hesitated. The idea of getting into a stranger's car, let alone a celebrity's, was overwhelming. It had been so long since anyone had treated him like an actual person, with dignity, with kindness. His first instinct was to say no. But something in Mel's eyes told him that this wasn't just some empty gesture. This wasn't pity. Slowly, painfully, George shifted to his feet. His legs were weak, his body unsteady, but Mel didn't rush him. When he finally straightened, Mel placed a supportive hand on his back. "Come on," Mel said again, softer this time. George swallowed hard, then gave the smallest nod. The boys stood frozen, watching as the man they had mocked just minutes ago climbed into the car of one of the most famous actors in the world. It didn't make sense. In their minds, someone like Mel Gibson didn't belong in the same reality as a homeless veteran. People like George were supposed to be ignored, to fade into the background, not to be acknowledged, certainly not to be invited into the same car as a Hollywood star. Diego shook his head in disbelief. "This is crazy." Ahmed shifted uncomfortably. "Why is he doing this?" Yuri, still staring at the car, murmured, "Maybe he actually gives a damn." The car door closed, and as Mel pulled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The boys still stood there, their expressions no longer smug but thoughtful, perhaps even ashamed. He didn't need to say anything more to them. The message had been received. George sat in the passenger seat, silent for a long time. He stared at his hands, still trying to process what had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" Mel kept his eyes on the road. "Because no one should be treated like that." George exhaled shakily. He had spent years believing he was worthless, that the world had forgotten him. But tonight, against all odds, someone had reminded him that he still mattered. The hum of the car engine was the only sound between them as Mel drove through the quiet streets of Los Angeles. George sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his fingers curled into the fabric of his worn coat. It had been years since he had ridden in a car like this, years since anyone had looked at him as more than a problem to avoid. Mel didn't push him to talk. He let the silence sit, knowing that sometimes silence was easier than words. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of a small, 24-hour diner on the corner of a dimly lit street. The neon sign flickered above them, casting a bluish glow over the pavement. "Come on," Mel said, turning off the ignition. "Let's get you something warm." George hesitated, his pride warring with his hunger. But the smell of grilled food and fresh coffee drifted through the air, and his stomach clenched painfully. Finally he nodded. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress behind the counter barely looked up as they entered, only offering a tired, "Sit anywhere you like." Mel led George to a booth near the window, the vinyl seats cracked but still comfortable. When the waitress approached, Mel didn't even ask. He just ordered. "Cheeseburger, fries and a coffee," he said, then glanced at George. "That sound good?" George swallowed hard, nodding again. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a real meal. As they waited, Mel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You served in Iraq and Afghanistan, right?" George blinked at him. "How'd you know?" Mel shrugged. "I know the look." George exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Army." His voice was hoarse, like he wasn't used to talking this much. "Came back. Couldn't adjust. PTSD, nightmares. Lost my job. Lost my home. One thing led to another, and here I am." Mel nodded, listening, not interrupting, just listening. George sighed. "People don't understand what it's like. You come home and you're not the same. You can't be. You see things, do things, and then they expect you to just fit back into normal life." His gaze dropped to the table. "But you don't." The food arrived, and George hesitated only a second before picking up the burger, his hands shaking slightly. The first bite was almost overwhelming. He chewed slowly, as if savoring something he thought he'd never have. Again. Mel watched him for a moment before speaking. "You ever think about getting back on your feet?" George let out a dry chuckle. "Every day. But it's not that simple. You don't just wake up and fix your life. People look at you different. They don't trust you. And after a while, you stop trusting yourself." Mel nodded thoughtfully, then leaned back in his seat. "What if I told you I could help?" George paused mid-bite, glancing up. "What?" "I've got connections," Mel said simply. "I can get you a job, help you get back on your feet, but you have to want it." George stared at him, searching his face for any sign of pity. But there was none. Just sincerity. "You don't even know me," George muttered. Mel smiled faintly. "I don't have to. I know you served. I know you sacrificed. That's enough." George's throat tightened. He set his burger down, suddenly unable to eat. "You don't owe me anything. No," Mel said, "but that doesn't mean I can't do something." Meanwhile, outside the diner, Diego, Ahmed, and Yuri lingered near the window, watching. They had followed them out of curiosity, maybe even defiance. But now, as they listened, something shifted. They had mocked George without a second thought. They had seen him as nothing more than a nuisance, a man who had failed at life. But hearing his story, his struggle, his pain, it was different. It was real. Ahmed swallowed hard. "I didn't know." Yuri nodded, his face pale. "None of us did." Diego looked at the ground. His earlier confidence was gone. Inside, George shook his head, still grappling with the reality of what Mel was offering. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted. Mel didn't push. He simply took a sip of his coffee, then said, "I think you can." Just then, the door to the diner opened, and the 3 boys hesitantly stepped inside. They stood awkwardly, near the booth, shifting from foot to foot. Mel glanced at them but said nothing. He waited. Finally, Diego spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Hey, we wanted to say we're sorry." George blinked, taken aback. "We were." "Jerks," Ahmed added. "We didn't know what you'd been through." Yuri nodded. "We just saw some guy on the street. We didn't think about what got you there." He hesitated. It wasn't right. George stared at them, unsure how to respond. He had been ignored, mocked, beaten down for so long that he never expected an apology, especially not from the same kids who had tormented him hours earlier. Mel watched the exchange, then leaned forward slightly. "It's easy to judge someone when you don't know their story," he said, "but everyone's fighting a battle you can't see." The boys nodded, shame flickering across their faces. Mel continued, his voice calm but firm. "You've got a choice. You can go through life looking down on people, thinking you're better, or you can decide to see them, to really see them." He gestured toward George. "This man has given more than you could ever imagine, and yet here you were, treating him like he was nothing." The boys shifted again, their embarrassment deepening. George cleared his throat. "Took guts to come in here," he muttered. "Not a lot of people would do that." Diego looked up. "Yeah?" George nodded. "Yeah." For the first time, the tension lifted. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was something. Mel set a few bills on the table to cover the meal, then looked at George. "So, what do you say?" George hesitated, then slowly exhaled. "Okay." A small smile tugged at Mel's lips. "Good." The boys stood back as George and Mel got up from the booth. As they walked toward the door, Diego hesitated before calling out, "Hey, Mr. Gibson." Mel turned. "Thanks," Diego said quietly, "for the lesson." Mel nodded, his expression knowing. "Just make sure you don't forget it." And with that, they stepped out into the night. For George, it was a second chance, and for three young men, it was the beginning of understanding what it truly meant to be human. The night air was crisp as Mel Gibson led the three boys toward a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles. The sign above the door read, "Hope for Heroes, Veterans Shelter." The boys hesitated just outside, exchanging nervous glances. They hadn't expected this. "You want to understand?" Mel said, holding the door open. "Then come inside." Diego, Ahmed, and Yuri stepped through the doorway, their earlier arrogance long gone. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of strong coffee and the low murmur of voices. Men of various ages sat at worn-out tables, some deep in quiet conversation, others staring absently at the walls, lost in thoughts only they could understand. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s approached. His hair was graying, his face lined with age and hardship, but his handshake was firm. "Mel," he greeted with familiarity. "Tom," Mel said with a nod. "Got some kids here who need to hear some stories." Tom studied the boys, his eyes piercing but not unkind. "That so?" Mel gestured for the boys to follow as Tom led them to a group of veterans gathered in a small lounge area. The boys took hesitant seats as Tom introduced them to a few of the men. "This is Greg," Tom said, nodding toward a man with a prosthetic leg. "Marine Corps. Lost that in Afghanistan." Greg gave them a tired smile. "Stepped on an IED. Took 3 of my buddies with it. I got lucky." The boys swallowed hard. Tom turned to another man, his face weathered but his posture still proud. "And this here is James. He was in Fallujah. Watched half his unit go down in one day." James exhaled sharply. "Came back with PTSD so bad my wife left. Lost my house, my job. Ended up here." The stories continued. Men who had given everything, only to return home to nothing. Soldiers who had risked their lives, only to be discarded by the very country they fought for. The boys sat in stunned silence, absorbing every word. After a while, Ahmed finally spoke. I didn't know." Yuri rubbed the back of his neck, ashamed. "We were just messing around. We didn't think about—" He gestured vaguely at the men around him. "You didn't think," Tom finished for him. "That's the problem. People see us and assume we're failures. But we weren't always like this." He looked at George, who had been listening quietly from the corner of the room. "And neither was he." George straightened, a flicker of emotion passing through. His eyes, He wasn't just a nameless face on the street anymore. He was a part of something again. Mel clapped a hand on George's shoulder. That's why we're here. Not just to hear their stories, but to do something about it. Diego, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. How? Mel smiled. You start by showing up. Over the next few weeks, Diego, Ahmed, and Yuri did just that. They returned to Hope for Heroes every weekend, helping serve meals, clean the shelter, and listen to the veterans. At first it was awkward, but gradually they got to know the men, learned their names, their histories. One afternoon, as Diego was helping an older vet fold laundry, he finally turned to George. You gonna take Gibson up on his offer? George hesitated. I don't know. You should, Ahmed chimed in. You deserve another chance, man. George studied them, the same boys who had once tormented him. But they weren't the same anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be either. The next day, Mel walked George into a local Veterans Assistance Center. Within a week, George had a temporary place to stay, fresh clothes, and an interview lined up. Within a month, he had a job, helping other veterans find resources to rebuild their own lives. For the first time in years, he felt like a soldier again, not in war, but in purpose. Months passed. One evening, Mel sat in a small restaurant, watching, as George entered. But this wasn't the same George who had once cowered under the taunts of 3 teenagers. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard shaved. He stood tall, his posture strong. He wore a simple but clean button-up shirt, and there was a quiet confidence in his step. And following him into the restaurant, laughing and talking, were Diego, Ahmed, and Yuri. They took their seats, and George looked at them, shaking his head with a smirk. If you'd told me a year ago I'd be having dinner with you 3, I'd have called you crazy. Diego chuckled. Yeah, well, we were kinda awful. George exhaled, looking at them seriously. Yeah, you were. Then, with a small smile, he added, but people can change. Mel watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He had stepped in that night because he couldn't stand by and watch injustice. But what had happened since? That had been their doing. They had learned, they had grown. As the meal was served, George lifted his glass of water. 2 second chances, he said. The boys exchanged glances before lifting their own glasses. 2 second chances, they echoed. And somewhere deep inside, George finally felt at peace.